Welcome to Section 420, Talkin Yankees. Well, we have a very special guest for you this episode. His name is Phil S. Dixon. Now, he's a historian, an author, and public speaker with over 40 years' experience researching Negro League Baseball. He's actually, in fact, one of the premier experts of Negro League Baseball in the country, and he also helped co-found the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City. So he's going to join us shortly, tell us about his journey, some of the books he's published, including his latest title, John Buck O'Neill, the Rookie, His Words, His Voice, which includes a unique feature that readers will find interesting. He'll give us the inside story about that, as well as tell us some of the time he spent with the Kansas City Royals organization in the PR department, and overall just some of the interviews he's had and the relationships he's developed over this 4-decade journey of his. But before we get into the conversation, if you haven't done it already, make sure you check out the audio version of the show. There's a podcast available, so wherever you get your favorite podcast, whether it's Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, search for Section 420 Talkin Yankees, the podcast, subscribe, and you get the benefit of exclusive content only available for podcast subscribers. So get little rants, little ravings. And I know you like to see me visually, you like to watch me on YouTube, maybe catch me on TV, but it's not enough. You want to hear me more often, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. So now enjoy this conversation with Phil. Hey, Phil, welcome to the show.
Good morning there, James.
Well, Phil S. Dixon, it's a pleasure to have you here. Now, people can follow you on both Instagram and Twitter at Negro League Man, as well as check out your website, NLBA Alive, as in Negro League Baseball Alive.com, where they can check out your Buck O'Neill book, which we'll get into. And again, it's a pleasure to have you. You're probably one of the premier researchers of Negro League Baseball in the country. So just to start off, like, what's your passion about Negro League Baseball, where you've spent the better part of 4 decades looking into this and researching this and talking about this?
Well, I truly love baseball. That's my initial passion. Love baseball far back as I can remember. As a matter of fact, my mother said I used to go to church, and the first church song I knew was "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." And so I was singing that in church, and I wasn't even 5 years old. But yeah, it's been a lifelong passion. So every day I wake up and I think about baseball. I've had the experience of being able to research for over 40 plus years, and have had award-winning books, been in lots of documentaries, and I coached for 30 years as well. So I know the game quite well. And so it's just been a great joy, and it's a hobby that just never stopped giving, and it hasn't stopped giving yet.
You've interviewed probably getting close to 500, whether former players, family members, or offspring. Just, on the top of your head, any of those interviews or conversations that really just stick out in your mind, just when you look back?
Oh, yeah, some of the great people, and that's one of the things when I started doing research and history on the Negro baseball leagues, I was able to get a lot of those players that people who are writing about the topic today never knew. So I got a chance to interview people like Cool Papa Bell. Actually, I can remember interviewing lots of people around the Memphis area, Kansas City area. And so Cool Papa Bell was one that really stood out for me because I got to know him really well and visit him on many occasions. Of course, John Buck O'Neill, who just recently got in the Hall of Fame. I knew Buck O'Neill way back. The earliest interviews you can ever find on Buck O'Neill are the ones that I did. And so I had a chance, to meet Hilton Smith, who died in 1983, Willard Brown, who was in the Hall of Fame. Buck Leonard, went to his house in Rocky Mount, North Carolina in 1982. So I think when I started and having the longevity has put me in a pretty unique place to tell some of these stories. And at the bottom of it all, I truly love baseball and I know the game.
So you graduated from the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and then shortly after that, you work your way to actually be in the PR office for the Kansas City Royals. So tell us about that journey.
Yeah, and actually it was the reverse. I worked at the Royals years ago. I was a freelance sports writer, and I would go out to the stadiums, cover the team. And when Jim Campanis came out, and we're talking about a few years ago. And it talked about there were no blacks in the front office and didn't have the capabilities and all that mess. I just happened to be there. And so we're talking about the 80s. And so that's how I initially got into baseball. as a job. As a matter of fact, Buck O'Neill was one of the people who recommended me. But I was at the ballpark all the time, freelance sports writing. And so that kind of led to my working for the Kansas City Royals. And I worked for them as assistant director of public relations for several years after already carrying a major league press pass. And so that was my introduction to actually working in the big leagues, which opened up another window of understanding for me how teams run.
So how long were you with the organization?
I think I was with the Royals about 3 years. I call them the golden years. George Brett was still there. Bo Jackson was still there. Frank White, Willie Wilson, Danny Tartable, who goes on to New York. He was still there. And then I met a lot of scouts. When the Yankees used to come through, I would always talk to Phil Rizzuto, and Bill White was another one I talked to real frequently. So I got to know a lot of people because I'm there. Not only was I in the press booth to start, but when I start working with the Royals, I have even more access to them.
And actually, funny enough, you mentioned Danny Tartable. When I was a kid, actually I had his poster with the Yankees on my wall. And actually, it still might be there to this day. I haven't visited my room, my parents' house in a while, but yeah, I definitely had the Tartable poster.
Yeah, sure. He's a good guy. Let's see. He announced that he wanted to marry his fiance, and so as a public relation guy, he had me set up everything. So we actually set up some stuff in a local park. I selected the park because he didn't know Kansas City that well, and we got a fireworks guy to get a sign that he could light up and say, "Will you marry me?" So it's good memories. Somewhere in my house, I have his wedding invitation too, as well.
Now, you also serve on the National Advisory Board for the Negro League Museum. Just tell us how you got involved with that.
Well, I was there from the beginning. I'm one of the co-founders of the Negro League Baseball Museum in Kansas City. Originally, it was 5 of us who signed the incorporation papers. Most people know about Buck O'Neill, who was the oldest person at that particular time. But the youngest person was myself. And if you ever look at the incorporation papers, you'll see John Buck O'Neill's name. And right below it is the youngest person is Phil Dixon. And I'm just honored to be out here still telling the story. And that was 30, I guess that was 1990. So we're talking about 32 years ago, and I'm still out here and still telling the story. And so, yeah, I've been involved with the museum from the very beginning and still active with the museum.
Obviously, Buck O'Neill is definitely one of the driving forces behind that museum. Why was it so, you think in his mind, so passionate to get this museum and just get these stories out there and, tell the story of Negro League Baseball?
Yeah. Well, a lot of people realize that, Buck's name is out there. But when we started, Buck was not a historian. Buck was a knowledgeable man of his time. So he knew about all the players that he had played against in his time, but he couldn't talk about people like, Bud Fowler, or going back to the turn of the century, Rube Foster. He couldn't talk about those kind of people real well. And so you needed historians. And I just happened to be the guy who could do that, to tie it all together. So I had talked about a museum at least 10 years before that. The earliest mentions of a museum were articles that I did. Originally, they were trying to make a museum in Ashland, Kentucky. And I went down to Ashland maybe about 1981, 82. And I came back and I told Buck, I said, you know what? We can do this thing here better than they can do it in Ashland. And that was the beginning. But most people know Buck for the museum, but there were some other forces, that helped to make this whole thing happen.
And I was just doing a little reading about Buck, and actually, never knew that he actually served in the Navy for 2 years. So actually gave up 2, prime playing years to go serve during World War II.
Yeah, that's the story of quite a few players. Some in World War I as well. And even Ernie Banks. Ernie Banks came to the Monarchs in 1950, but he was away in the military. And then he came back in 53, and you know the rest of the story, right? So, yeah, a lot of players lost time, but they helped this nation a great deal. So I guess it was time well spent.
Speaking of Buck, your book, John Buck O'Neill, The Rookie, his voice, his words, it's available. Again, people can check it out on your website, NLBAalive.com, also on Amazon as well. So you kind of look at his rookie year in 1938. So, what maybe made you structure the book and tell the story in that way?
Yeah, here's the book right here. And of course, available at my website is nlbalive.com, like Negro League Baseball or Alive. And so, yeah, what I want to do, and I try to do this because it's so much information, trying to tell a really good detailed story like I like to tell, that it's hard for me to tell a whole lifetime in one book. So I bite off little pieces. And so I took Buck O'Neill's life from the day he was born up to his first full complete season with the Kansas City Monarchs. This is where he made his name. It's his adopted home. And so I wanted to give a little more detail about what happened in that 1938 season. So if you pick up the book, what you'll be able to do is follow the team from game to game to game. And actually, you're barnstorming with the team. So you know where the team is every day. And typically, when you do an overview, you can't, of a person's entire career, you can't dig that deep. And so I like to tell a story inside a story, but I like people to walk away knowing more than they knew when they first picked up the book. So I tend to dig a little deeper. And then when I do that, trying to tell those stories and make them interesting and relevant to you today is something that I kind of specialize in. So you'll read a lot of social history in mine. Now, with this book, the nice thing I have is that it's the first sports book ever to use QR codes. So you can actually hear Buck telling you some of these stories from an interview in 1985. And once again, this is the earliest recorded interview you'll ever hear of Buck O'Neill talking. And so it came from a 4-hour session that we did back in 1985. So, and it's just little snippets, but the book is quite detailed in its storytelling. But I think once you read it, you will find a very interesting story.
And so it's a very unique way to tell a story, and plus has plenty of photos, and of course again you actually hear his voice too. So almost like as you're reading it, kind of like he's telling you the story. So I just think it's incredible, and it's just definitely good use of the technology. So and also one of your previous works, you kind of mentioned barnstorming a few times. 3 years ago, you came out with the Dizzy Dean Barnstorming Tour book, which was basically, it was 13 games where a bunch of major leaguers after the 1934 season went out to play some Negro League teams, and you kind of get into the way the media covered those games. So can you just maybe tell us a little about that?
Yeah. And I've been known to dig deep and think in ways that people don't ordinarily think in presenting this topic. So the Dizzy and Daffy Dean Barnstorming Tour for me was a perfect storm. Because Dizzy is at the top of his game. So you got a great baseball player. Him and his brother were real strong. Then they're playing 4 of the top Black baseball teams, but they have different all-stars in every city that they went into. And it gave me a chance to show some of the disparity. I would talk about how the media didn't cover them, but I went in a different way in showing you that. And I show you who the people who were working in those media were. And I talk about how they wrote about the team. Also, it gave me a chance to show, for instance, you would have baseball players who maybe they were born in Europe, England, Australia, and those guys could come in and they would be white players. They could play in the major leagues, whereas you might have a Black player whose family was here for generations, former slaves, and they couldn't play. And so to illustrate that, it's a delicate balance, because you don't want to take away from the baseball story, because the baseball story is good, but to be able to tell a social story at the end of that process, I think people walk away a little stronger in their knowledge about equality and understanding the injustices of the past and maybe how we can correct them in the future.
Major League Baseball said that now the Negro League statistics will now count towards the Major League statistics, which I think it's 2 ways of looking at that. Like it's kind of about time, but also you think does it like kind of almost hurt a little bit just because the Negro League Baseball was just almost like its own little world and it was like such it's like a own universe. Maybe it would be better to just keep it in that universe. What were your thoughts on that?
Well, when you tell the Negro League story, you have to tell the Negro League story. I think some people want the Negro League story to be the Major League story, or the Major League story to be the Negro League story. And so I try to not do that. As a matter of fact, if you read any of my books from from the very first time I started writing 30 years ago, you don't see me saying this person had a lifetime batting average of this and all that. It's all crap, and it's a crapshoot. And so over the years, I've seen all of those totals change over and over and over again. And I just feel there's a better way to tell the story than just using numbers. And because I go out and I speak to a lot of groups, what I realize is most people don't care about those numbers. They're looking for a good story that they can relate to enjoy this history. So years ago, I did away with the numbers. When I first started following baseball, I one of the first characters I followed was Babe Ruth. And if you had asked me if 714 home runs was good, or you know, or if a 300 hitter was good, even if you asked me if somebody struck out 2,000 times was that bad, I wouldn't have known at all. But when they said Babe Ruth ate 21 hot dogs, I knew what 21 hot dogs were. And just like that, I'm interested in baseball because I found a way to connect. And even right with his nickname. Of course, I didn't know anybody nicknamed Babe, but I thought it was interesting. And little things like that hemmed me in as a fan. And all these years later, I'm still a fan and a passionate one at that.
Really quick with the Barnstormer series, I've seen some clips, like maybe interviews, but did anyone actually capture any of these games on film? I know there weren't a lot of them, but is there actually footage of the actual games themselves?
No, I haven't seen much on film, and that's an area that the Negro Leagues will come up short on, is having great film footage. Occasionally, I'll see different footage. As a matter of fact, I was this recent documentary on the House of David has some footage in there that has not been seen before, but of Negro Leaguers. But yeah, that's an area that the Negro League is going to fall short. So you have to tell these stories, and you have to be able to tell these stories well. And just finding an old newspaper account and regurgitating it is not really telling a story. When you dig deeply, you begin to know the personalities of the players. And, I'll use an example. I talk a lot about Judd Wilson. And if you look at other people's writings on Judd Wilson, they'll talk about how, he was a pretty mean player, nasty player. But when you read my work, I try to tell you why he acted that way. And so I dig a little deeper because I think most people aren't born mean. It's a process of how they got there. But if you don't spend any time trying to understand them and you just throw out the information that he had a fight here, a fight there, I think that you leave your readers in a very difficult spot in following the story. So, and one other thing I might mention too, in between 2014 and 2019, I went on a 200 city barnstorming tour. Actually, it was probably about 250 cities, but if I went to, say, Wichita or Omaha or Springfield, St. Louis, I only counted it one time. So I went to more cities, but I wanted to barnstorm like the teams did, and that's going from city to city. You travel in, and I didn't fly any of it. I went all by car. And to all of these places, I even went as far as Canada. And many times I would speak night after night after night. And when I finished that whole tour, I had a whole new appreciation for what these men had done, because it took me 4 or 5 years. That takes me actually 4 years to do 200 different cities. And these guys would do this in one year sometimes, or 2 years. But they certainly were playing 200 games in a year. And not like the major leagues where they come in, they sit in, they play a 4 game set, and then you go on to the next town, and then maybe you make 2 trips into a city to play, a series. What we're used to as baseball fans. It was not that at all. And so uh, to be able to tell that story, I thought it might be nice if I could experience that story. And once I did, the first book to come out of that was the Dizzy and Daffy Dean Barnstorming Tour, Race, Media, and America's National Pastime. And of course, the Buck O'Neill book is just a continuation of that barnstorming type of feel. So it's a different feel. And once again, when you read a Phil Dixon book, I want you to have not just a entertaining read. I want you to have an experience.
All right, that's awesome. You did it that way, and I'm the same way. I'm more of a road person. I hate flying, so I probably would have done the same thing in your shoes as well. And it's really quickly with the Negro League Baseball Museum. Another member of the advisory board is the baseball historian Ken Burns. You have any experiences working with him or chatting with him? How is he like?
Yeah. I had lots of experience with Ken Burns. Now one of them, my wife always says, "Why do you always have a problem with Ken Burns?" And I'll tell you why. When Ken Burns did his baseball series, he never used any Black historians. But when it came to the major leagues, he used fans, he used historians, and he used ball players and announcers. But when it came to the Negro Leagues, he went and got his one specialized historian who was not a baseball historian. And at that time, I had a really strong book, and all they wanted from me was pictures. And so I feel like that is a continuation and a perpetuation of the racism that exists in sports. And so that's the reason why I'm not a big Ken Burns supporter. He does great work, but if you really ask me and you really want the truth, which I'm going to give you because I'm not beholden to any organization, I'm going to tell you that there was definitely some shortcomings in the baseball series. And years later, well, actually, it was about a year after his baseball series came out, I was invited to New York, and it was an awards presentation, and they had Ken Burns there receiving the same award that they were going to give me. And so I just asked them, "So why do you have me coming up there?" And they said, "Well, we know because he got it out of your book." And so somebody recognized it. But most people who watch the baseball series, they never catch the fact that there's no Black historians and no Black baseball fans in this documentary. Never catch it. So, but it's my job as a historian to catch all of that and continue to tell the story in the way that I think best.
And before you mentioned the House of David project, I saw you posting about it. So how does that relate again to baseball history? Can you just give us the background of the whole thing as well as the documentary that you were involved with?
Sure. The House of David connection for me started back in the 1980s. I interviewed a guy by the name of Maurice Doolittle Young, who played for the 1927 Kansas City Monarchs. And as we were talking, he had some photographs from the House of David. And of course, the House of David is a religious colony out of Benton Harbor, Michigan. They were all white. And he began to tell me the story of how he tried to get into the House of David colony by using his Choctaw Indian heritage. And he had to prove that he was, I think he said 2/3 or something Choctaw. Anyway, he couldn't prove it. He couldn't get in the House of David. But Doolittle Young was quite the student of religion and baseball. And so he began to tell me about Haile Selassie and Daddy Grace and Father Divine and Ben Parnell of the House of David. So I'm a young guy and I'm just listening. And so when I published my book, The Negro Baseball Leagues of Photographic History, I had put a whole segment in there related to the House of David because the House of David played many Negro League teams. They played many. They would even invite them originally into Benton Harbor, Michigan, when they had their own park. But when they went out and they were barnstorming, they played against the Kansas City Monarchs, the Homestead Grays, New York Black Yankees. It goes on and on and on, who they would play against. And then there was a story in 1934 at the Denver Post tournament when the House of David hired Satchel Paige and Bill Perkins is the battery to beat the Kansas City Monarchs in that tournament. So I knew all of this. And when these guys got together and they began to produce this House of David documentary, they had heard about all that I knew about the players and things like that I've been researching. And so they came to Kansas City and filmed me, and I became a part of an award-winning documentary. It's a 2 hour long, but I'm telling you, it's a great piece of work. And if you ever heard me speak live, I always mention the House of David. Been doing this for years. When I was on my 200 city tour, they were a regular part of that tour. As far as me talking about these games they played against Negro League teams. So that's how I became interested in the House of David, through a Negro League player, Maurice Doolittle Young. And so here it is today. I just returned from Michigan, and I actually had a chance to go to the Colony. And turns out one of the guys at the Colony had seen the documentary, and he recognized me. I'm the only black guy in the documentary. Right? He recognized me, and because he liked the job that I did and my passion for the team, he took me every place that you could take me on the Colony, where that he could take me. And I talked to a gentleman up there who had invited me, and he said nobody gets that tour. So I just really feel blessed, and it's just another one of those things where after I left Benton Harbor, I don't know how I ever wrote of the House of David without visiting Benton Harbor. But when I write of the House of David again, after visiting Benton Harbor, it's going to be just like when I wrote about barnstorming after taking the 200 city tour.
People could check out pictures of it, your Instagram, as well as at Negro League Man. So you want to see pictures of this? I know you posted that. And again, they can follow you on Twitter at Negro League Man as well. And again, check out your website, NLB Alive, where they can get the John Buck O'Neill book, as well as your previous work. So Phil, a pleasure to have you. Again, you're an shrine of riches, and I just appreciate getting some of these stories and getting some of your insight. And again, good luck on your tours, and I know you have some more books coming down the road.
Oh, most definitely, and thank you, James, for another opportunity to talk about baseball. I just truly enjoy this game, and I love talking about it, and I love to see fans loving this game. How about that? So, thank you very much.